We often look to the past to understand ourselves. Tonight, we turn our attention to the year 1870 and the solemn story of Mary Fletcher and her 4 young children. It's a case that reminds us that behind historical records are real people whose lives were irrevocably changed by the events that transpired. This is their story, as best it can be told. Our setting is the village of Scotforth, on the southern edge of the historic city of Lancaster, in northern England. By 1870, it was a community of laborers, mill workers, and tradesmen. Life was dictated by the seasons of manual work, and for many, it was a precarious existence. In one of the modest stone cottages that lined the main road lived the Fletcher family. Their story is not one of grand ambition or public renown, but a quiet, domestic tragedy that would soon horrify the nation and raise difficult questions about poverty, mental health, and the darkest capabilities of the human heart. John Fletcher was a stonemason, a trade that demanded physical strength and skill. He was 38 years old and, for most of his life, had been a capable provider for his family. He was married to Mary, and together they had 4 small children who filled their small home: 7-year-old Anne, 5-year-old Elizabeth, 3-year-old John Jr., and the baby of the family, Thomas, who was just 9 months old. Their life was one of humble means, dictated by the availability of work and the modest wages John could earn. Neighbors knew them as a typical working-class family. Mary was occupied with the immense task of raising 4 young children in an era without modern conveniences, while John spent his days shaping stone. However, beneath this surface of domestic routine, severe pressures were mounting. John Fletcher had a reputation for heavy drinking, a common escape for men facing the relentless hardships of the time. This, combined with growing financial instability, began to fray the fabric of their family life, leading them toward a catastrophe no one could foresee. In the months leading up to the winter of 1870, John Fletcher's circumstances took a significant turn for the worse. He had been struck by a bout of illness that left him unable to work for several weeks. For a man whose entire livelihood depended on his physical labor, this was a devastating blow. With no income, the family's already meager savings were depleted, and they fell into debt. The strain appeared to weigh heavily on Fletcher's mind. His behavior grew increasingly erratic and alarming. Neighbors later recalled conversations in which he spoke with a profound sense of despair. He was described as being melancholic and despondent, convinced that his family was doomed to the workhouse, a fate widely feared for its shame and hardship. More troublingly, he began to express morbid thoughts, telling one neighbor that it might be better to make a quiet end to them all than to see them suffer such a fate. These were desperate words from a man in the grip of a severe depression. Yet in an era with no concept of mental health care, his cries for help went unheeded. The night of Friday, January 21st, 1870, began like any other in the Fletcher household. The children were put to bed, and a quiet stillness fell over the small cottage. Mary Fletcher likely had no idea that this night would be her last, or that the man she had married would become the agent of her and her children's destruction. In the dark hours of that night, driven by a logic warped by despair and alcohol, John Fletcher committed an unthinkable act.
He took up a stonemason's hammer, an implement of his trade, and moved through the silent house. He went from room to room, ending the lives of his sleeping wife and each of his 4 children. The act was one of brutal, shocking violence, carried out in the very place that should have been their sanctuary. After he had murdered his entire family, Fletcher then turned a razor on himself, inflicting a deep wound to his own throat in an attempt to end his own life. But his attempt failed. As the sun began to rise on a cold January morning, John Fletcher lay gravely injured in a house of profound and terrible silence. On the morning of Saturday, January 22nd, the Fletcher cottage remained unusually still. The curtains were still drawn, and no smoke rose from the chimney, a strange sight in a working-class home where the day started early. A neighbor, a quarryman named Thomas Gardner, passed the house on his way to work and noted the quiet. When he returned hours later and saw the house still shuttered and silent, a feeling of unease began to grow. The Fletchers had 4 young children. Their home was rarely, if ever, quiet. Gardner spoke with another neighbor, and their shared concern prompted them to act. They knocked on the door, but there was no answer. They called out, but only silence replied. Fearing that the family may have fallen ill, Thomas Gardner went to the back of the cottage and found a window unlatched. He hoisted himself up and peered inside. What he saw in the dim light was a scene of such horror that it would remain with him for the rest of his life. He immediately understood that a terrible tragedy had befallen the family within. Upon entering the cottage, Thomas Gardner was confronted with the full extent of the horror. The bodies of Mary Fletcher and her children lay in their beds. The scene was one of unimaginable violence. In another room, Gardner found John Fletcher. He was alive, but barely. He was lying on the floor, covered in blood from the severe self-inflicted wound to his throat. He was conscious, but unable to speak. Gardner rushed from the house to raise the alarm, and soon the small village of Scotforth was reeling from the news. The local police constable and a surgeon, Dr. Christopher Johnson, were summoned to the scene. Dr. Johnson attended to Fletcher's wound, an act that would save his life so that he could stand trial for his crimes. As the authorities began the grim task of documenting the scene and removing the bodies of the victims, John Fletcher was taken into custody. Though he could not speak, he was able to communicate by writing on a slate. His first written words were a direct and unambiguous confession to the murder of his wife and 4 children. With John Fletcher's confession, the basic facts of the case were not in dispute. The legal process began almost immediately with a coroner's inquest. This proceeding was held at a local public house, a common practice at the time, and was overseen by the county coroner. The jury, comprised of local men, heard the harrowing testimony of the neighbor who discovered the scene, the constable who was first to respond, and the surgeon who had examined the victims and the accused. The written confession from Fletcher was presented as definitive proof of his guilt. The evidence was overwhelming and deeply disturbing. The coroner's jury took very little time to reach their conclusion. They returned a verdict of willful murder against John Fletcher for the deaths of his wife, Mary, and his children, Anne, Elizabeth, John, and Thomas. Following the inquest, Fletcher was formally charged and committed to stand trial at the next Lancaster Assizes. The community was left to grieve and to try and comprehend how a husband and father could be responsible for such an atrocity.
The trial of John Fletcher for the murder of his family began in March 1870 before Mr. Justice Lush at the Lancaster Assizes. The prosecution's case was straightforward. They presented the facts of the crime, the medical evidence, and Fletcher's own clear confession. There was no question that he had committed the acts. The entire case, therefore, rested upon a single question. What was John Fletcher's state of mind on that fateful night? Fletcher's defense lawyer mounted a case based on the plea of insanity. He argued that Fletcher was not legally responsible for his actions because he was suffering from a morbid delusion. The defense presented witnesses, including the neighbors to whom Fletcher had spoken of his despair. They testified to his recent illness, his poverty, his depression, and his talk of ending his family's suffering. The argument was that Fletcher genuinely, if insanely, believed that killing his family was a merciful act to save them from the workhouse. The prosecution countered that Fletcher, while perhaps depressed and desperate, was not insane in the eyes of the law. He understood the nature of his actions and knew that they were wrong, as evidenced by his subsequent suicide attempt, which they framed as an act of a guilty conscience. The jury was tasked with deciding whether John Fletcher was a desperate but sane man who had committed a terrible crime, or a man so broken by mental illness that he was not responsible for his actions. After hearing all the evidence and the closing arguments from both the prosecution and the defense, the 12 men retired to deliberate. They returned to the courtroom in just over 10 minutes. Their speed spoke to the certainty of their conclusion. The foreman announced the verdict: guilty. The plea of insanity had been rejected. John Fletcher stood in the dock as the judge addressed him. Mr. Justice Lush spoke of the appalling nature of his crime, a crime that defied comprehension. He acknowledged Fletcher's impoverished state and troubles, but concluded that they could not excuse the annihilation of his entire family. Donning the black cap, the judge sentenced John Fletcher to be taken from that place to the jail and there to be hanged by the neck until he was dead. Fletcher, who had remained silent and composed throughout the trial, showed no visible reaction to the sentence.
John Fletcher spent his final weeks in Lancaster Castle, attended to by the prison chaplain. On the morning of Saturday, April 9, 1870, he was led from his cell to the gallows. The execution was carried out by the famous hangman William Calcraft. In accordance with a recent change in the law, the execution was conducted in private, within the prison walls, witnessed only by officials and members of the press. The tragic case of the Fletcher family left a deep scar on the community of Lancaster. It was a story that highlighted the terrible intersection of extreme poverty, social desperation, and severe mental illness in a society that had little understanding of or sympathy for the latter. The deaths of Mary Fletcher and her 4 innocent children served as a grim testament to the silent crises unfolding behind the closed doors of working-class homes in Victorian England.